Thanks again for inviting me. I'm going to talk a little bit about advances and what's going on here in the United States in terms of libraries. And I hope we have some time at the end for some questions and answers, or in my case, probably corrections more than anything else. So, hopefully, you can see my slides at this point. Yes. Okay. I'd like to talk about the community as the collection, and that might seem like a slightly odd discussion because libraries are all about collections and libraries are all about communities, and so it sort of seems natural to put them together. But when you suddenly think about the idea of what is the role of that community as being more than users, more than someone who consumes, more than someone who comes in, uses the library and walks away, it changes the dynamic that we have. It changes that mission. I very much appreciate the speeches that began this discussion about social change having a positive social effect, because I think that is the core mission of librarianship. I think that's what makes us a noble profession. So I would also warn you that when I agreed to do this, and they said we're going to do this on November 1st at 9:30 in the morning, I thought, great, I'll be awake, it'll be awesome. And then I realized that that's actually 9:30 at night on October 31st in the States. And in the United States, that's Halloween. And I, I don't know what Halloween, if or what it's like in Singapore. I apologize for my cultural ignorance. But here, it means people dressing up very oddly and eating a lot of sugar. So I may be a little jittery at points. So when I was asked to present, this was the presentation, the abstract I gave. And I just want to sort of highlight two parts of it because I'm going to sort of come around it an odd way. I think that the future of libraries is bright. I think we're in a really good position. And I know that's sort of hard to take when you hear about library budgets and justifying it and staffing. But I think when we look at what opportunities we have, what impact that libraries can have, and what impact librarians can have, I think it gets very exciting. And I'll be honest, I don't think that it's the same impact that we've had in the past, but I think that we have built an amazing platform to work from. So the future of libraries rests not in our collections, but in our engagement with communities. That is the idea of a community as the collection. And that libraries are learning institutions and they facilitate knowledge creation. And where that may be slightly different is in the past, we've always said we're in the knowledge business. But we've talked about things like knowledge containers. We've talked about things like giving access to knowledge, meaning access to collections and books and materials. And I think we really now need to think of knowledge as something very different, and that is uniquely human. And that librarians and libraries' role in knowledge creation is not one step removed. It's not we wait for someone to write a book and then we put on a book on a shelf and wait for someone to read it. And then we wait for them to write the next book and we buy it, etc. But it's very direct and it's part of the knowledge creation process. It's at the point of knowledge creation. That libraries are not just places where we read about other great thoughts, but where we help people develop their own great thoughts. Where the true collection, the true effort that librarians have isn't in the reading habits and the literacy habits and the consumption habits of our communities, but it's in their dreams, their aspirations, and their needs. And that no building and no institution can do that. It's up to people. So once again, I take very much the opening comments talking about librarians and how librarians do this and librarians do that. I mean, to put it bluntly, all libraries can do is exert gravity and decay. It's librarians that make things happen. And to sort of walk you through an analog of that, I'm going to start in an odd place, but I'm going to start with the good old-fashioned humble map. So, because maps have changed a bit. And, but yet when you think of a map, you probably aren't too much of a stretch to come up with an image like this. Some sort of drawing of land, right? Some illustration of topography. And yet, if you think about what maps have done and how the role they play in today's lives, they've changed pretty dramatically. I mean, the first step that we have to think about is that with the map and the idea that the map was sort of a document, was that we looked at technology and we said, what can we do with the map? And the first thing we did was we adopted it, right? We looked at digital technology, we looked at networks, we looked at servers, and we said, we can make something that's just like a map, but online, right? And that's what we ended up with. And this is MapQuest, which was one of the original ones. These days, no one goes to MapQuest. They all go to Google. We'll get there, trust me. But the point is that we really originally saw a map as a document, and we put a document online. And then we did something kind of crazy. We let people put in a starting point and an ending point, and they could get directions from it without our help. And that was really amazing. And this is sort of the story of any technology. As we look at the technologies we apply, the first thing we do is we adopt them, right? So right now, if you think about a lot of library resources, we're still in adoption phase, right? We talk about ebooks and e-journals as if they were books and journals, but they're sort of electronic and they're sort of digital. But the next idea is that we begin to extend that. Once we create this digital platform, once we create this opportunity, once we move into a new setting, we begin to extend it with new options and new opportunities. We saw this way back with printing, and in Asia it's probably bad to talk about Gutenberg, but the idea that once we began looking at books and materials and printing presses, we tried to emulate what handwritten texts and handwritten documents were. It took centuries to figure out things like title pages and page numbers and glossaries, and we began to say, well, we could do what we used to do, but now we can extend it slightly farther. And so one of the things that we often talk about, and this is a screen example of, is we can take pictures of places and we can map them to the physical place. The map becomes a way to not only see the land, but see pictures of what you would see if you were standing in this point. So it's not a dramatic departure from what a map is. It still feels like a map, it looks like a map, but now we can attach things to it. And we've seen this already go on in things like smartphones and cell phones, where we can now sort of have the map with us and we don't have to look like a tourist in Singapore because we're walking around with this big map and really bad clothing and shorts and not speaking the language. Right now we can look at our phones like everyone else is doing because we've lost eye contact as a civilization. But anyway, the idea here is that we're still extending what we can do here. They're still maps. They feel like maps. They look like maps. They've got some additional, but they're sort of map-like. The next phase that digital technology lets us sort of walk into is that we begin to adapt and innovate. We begin to do things that we could never think of or conceptualize with a physical map. Right? I mean, we could pick a physical map, we could put it up on a wall, and we could pin pictures to it. That's not that radical. We, for a long time put up maps and we could get different travel agencies that would give us directions and such, and that wasn't that different. But now we suddenly go, well, what could we do in this digital world that we could never do in a physical world, in a map world? And so in the map world, we begin to do things like checking in. We begin to realize that the map isn't just an interaction between me and the map. It's an interaction of me to all my friends and family and people through the map. And that idea of looking at that technology, that document, not as the end, not as my destination, but as a gateway or as an interface, or as we'll talk about later, a platform for people to be innovative and do different things, then it gets really different. Right, this notion of Foursquare, where I can find out where you are and what you're doing and what you thought about it where you were there and what pictures did you take. Right, this idea that we can check in at a place. We can say, oh, I didn't realize so-and-so was near me. I think I'll go have lunch with them, or I'll have dinner, or I didn't know they were in town, etc. We could never do that with a physical map. Suddenly, what was map-like begins to break down, and we begin to look at it very differently. And we begin to do some radical different adoptions. So these are some GIS adoptions, if you will, right? So the one in the upper left corner is a service called Waze that Google has purchased. And what Waze does is it says, you're driving around the city. Are we still there? Okay. So Waze says, you're driving around the city, you've got your phone on, your phone knows whether you're moving quickly, your phone knows whether you're moving in slowly. And so the idea is that they can actually tell the traffic based on where people are driving around. Now, we couldn't do that with an old physical map. You didn't like drive around shouting out the window going, "Hey, it's slow over here." That doesn't make sense. And yet we could do that with our phone. I mean, you could do scary things with the phone, by the way. There's a researcher in Harvard that can tell from the way that your phone is moving whether you have the flu or not, whether you're sick at home, and whether you're lying down a lot and coughing suddenly and things. And so, now you can not only reach out to call someone, but your phone can alert you that you should probably give them sympathy because they're not feeling well. That's a different use of a technology than we thought of before. In the right-hand corner, we have the notion of augmented reality, that as we're walking through the city, we can actually, right on top of the camera, take that map information, take that people information, take document information, and overlay it to the point where you can say, something interesting here, something interesting here. Museums are using this a lot so that you can, instead of handing out big guides, you can actually use your phone to do it. And at the bottom, you'll see an example where Bing, yes, they have a mapping service. You can now go into buildings and wander around buildings and see exhibits and things of that nature. The point of it is that this isn't a paper map anymore. What we've done is we've started with this platform, a platform which is traditionally seen as static, a platform that is seen as paper and analog based, a platform that is seen as one-to-one, meaning one person to one thing. And we've moved to a revolution where, in fact, what that map has become is a platform to allow us to interact with the world completely differently. And what's more importantly, that map information, that digital information, isn't just about places and illustrations of places. It's really a platform to allow people to innovate, combine information, people, conversations, discussion, knowledge building, and sharing, and bring it into this idea of space. Now, I'm going to argue that libraries and librarians are in very much the same place. That instead of thinking of ourselves as this analog houses full of documents that are slowly being digitized, and that we're building these one-to-one relationships, we can think of libraries instead as being platforms for innovation, platforms for interaction, platform for augmentation. The idea that really what we are is no longer warehouses of information trying to deal with information scarcity. We are platforms that allow for people to do knowledge creation and to make things mean something in a world of attention scarcity. The scarcity is no longer in getting at information and materials. The scarcity is in paying attention to that which matters. So we've moved from pictures of places to an infrastructure that moved from items to relationships, redefined, integrated from the sort of monolithic, this is a map, to interoperable, where the map allows us to get to pictures and documents and people and places and technology and applications. And we've opened it up for innovation and participation. Right? We're seeing this now in a very interesting place. We're seeing this in ourselves. We're seeing this in how we deal with health. So I happen to be in the middle of a rather nasty battle with my health at this point. And it's got me really interested in, I guess, observing exactly how unhealthy I am at any given point. But we have all these devices now that can tell us how long we've walked and how many stairs we've gone up and what our blood pressure is and what our pulse is and what our temperature is and what, all of this data. In fact, I was talking with a medical equipment manufacturer, and he was talking about expanding markets. And he said, our market is not into hospitals. Yes, that's our market. We sell things to hospitals. We sell them to doctors' offices. We sell them to clinics. But when we look ahead, the big market for us is in consumers. It's in what, and I love this phrase, he called the worried well. These are people who are perfectly healthy, but they want to make sure they're still perfectly healthy, or how can you get healthier, and they jog every day and want to know how fast they're going and all of these things. And so we've actually made ourselves into a platform. So I walk around with this thing called a Fitbit, which sits on my pocket, and it measures how much I walk and it measures how many stairs I go up. and it wirelessly talks to my phone every few minutes to tell it how I'm doing. And my phone tells my friends. What's scary is my phone tells my wife, who then calls me on the phone and says, get moving. But this idea that we've become platforms, and we're thinking about how does this change the notion of a document? So one of the most fundamental documents in medicine is the idea of a medical health record. Right? So this is when you go, the doctor fills out what they thought of you and what's wrong with you and, I guess what your colon's doing today and all those wonderful things. I love the question mark. Anyway, you got to wonder, does the doctor not know what that part is? Anyway, so they had these medical health records, and the idea was that it used to be a document for the doctor. And then we made them electronic so we could send them from doctor to doctor. But this idea that this is somehow owned, possessed, controlled, understood by the doctor is changing radically. One, by these devices I mentioned before. Now when the doctor, instead of asking you, are you very active, how much do you walk, what's your heart rate, etc., I can not only not lie to him, not that I would ever do that, but he can actually say, well, your belt says differently. Your belt says that you were sitting around all day. By the way, if you ever want more steps, just attach it to your dog and let your dog run around. It works perfectly. I also found out if you pace around while the elevator's going up, it considers that climbing stairs. I'm not telling you this to cheat, but just in case you do. So now that the doctor can have a very different conversation with the patient, because the patient is now contributing to this record and part of it. But we need to look where the map analogy told us how we begin to change relationship with documents. That is, that documents become portals and platforms for interoperability. The medical health record begins to show us that what it really begins to evolve into is not a document or a set of documents or a series of documents, but an ongoing conversation. In this case, an ongoing conversation with my doctor, but not only is not only are my devices telling my doctor, but maybe I'm adding documents. In other words, as the doctor's looking at this and saying, you have X and Y disease, here's your information prescription, you should be going and following up on that. We're looking at that in a lot of hospitals in the United States where when you check out of the hospital, not only do you get here are the medicines you should take and here's your physical activity, but here's what you should read. And here's what you should understand. And here's an app to keep control of your diet. This idea that this medical record is no longer simply an archive, but a living connection between a doctor, a patient, materials they need. But what about a patient blog? As patients are going through a journey of cancer or a journey of heart disease or a journey of weight loss, they can reflect on what their feelings are, their thoughts are, their emotions. So instead of having this form to check out once a month saying, are you depressed? Which is fabulous when you're going to a doctor and they say, are you depressed? And you're kind of like, well, I wasn't until I talked to you. I swear to God, this is true. I was talking to a doctor and he took blood and he came back and he said, you're anemic. Your red blood count is very low. And he looked at me and he, with all seriousness, said, are you bleeding? And I'm looking at him. I don't think so. I mean, you're the doctor. Maybe you could check real quick. Anyway, but we know that we can use these sort of journal activities to connect people together. That we now have real-life devices where they're installing devices so that what they can do is the doctor can be alerted by the devices that you're wearing that you're having a heart attack. The doctor can check on the condition and order your devices implanted in your body to deliver drugs directly into your system. This idea of being a wired human being, that we are platforms in an ongoing conversation with doctors and experts, is really interesting to me in general. It stretches what it means to be a medical librarian. It stretches what it means to be a public librarian when this is the kind of data that people are walking around with. And it's challenging the medical profession to talk about their relationship to a patient. The relationship to a patient used to be, you are a set of illnesses sitting in my office. I'm going to diagnose you, cure you, and throw you out. right? Now, patients are going in and saying, have you checked this? Have you checked that? Did you read the latest news result from this? Have you seen the latest treatment results for this? We're educating the doctors as much as they're educating us. And doctors love that, by the way. But it changes this relationship. And once again, I'll ask you to think of an analogy for a moment, which is think about as a librarian. It used to be that we would expect a relatively uninformed, unconnected public to come to us, either in our universities or our hospitals or our public libraries or our school libraries, and ask a question. And we had access to this rare and privileged sources of information because they were very expensive. Now we know that people are searching all over the places, and so what need do they have of librarians? And I would tell you they have a radical and important need for librarians, but it's no longer as gatekeeper. It is instead as people who can help guide them through that world of information, that help make sense of that world of information, that says when you have cancer, this stuff that comes from the National Institutes of Health, you should probably spend some time with. This stuff from Dave's blog and stuff, you could probably pass, right? That idea of information literacy, but not as classes on how to use a library, but real time, in a situation, with real needs, with real outcomes. That's where we can be incredibly powerful. This idea that we are looking at platforms for interchange. We look at this idea of a phone, it's no longer a phone. It's an information access device, and this allows us to be at the point of decision making, at the point of creation. So what are the implications for libraries? The first is to stop thinking of the library as a place. Stop thinking of the library as a collection, most certainly. That collection, those materials, those stacks, those journals, those database subscriptions are important. But they are tools to a larger aim. That larger aim of learning, of engagement, of aspirations, that's why we're librarians, and that's why we have those. We sometimes forget when we get so busy with metadata and cataloging and collection development and acquisitions and all of these things that those aren't why we're here. That's the necessary stuff to get us where we need to be, which is right in the problem solving of our communities. So our libraries can be trusted platforms. For example, take this notion, as was mentioned earlier, the notion of we can't take 100 librarians and put them on planes and fly them around for a year to all these different countries to get trained, right? One of the interesting developments going on is around something called MOOCs, massive open online courses. But even MOOCs, that's the latest trend. We know that online education, the idea of taking webinars, the idea of where someone is not as important as how well they're connected. That's going on now. And not only is it happening for librarians, it's happening for doctors, it's happening for lawyers, it's happening for transportation employees, it's happening for computer scientists, it's happening for all sorts of people. Imagine if we could create the equivalent of a medical health record, but this is a personal education record, where not only do we have this conversation and subscriptions and all this, but we have this record that when we apply for the next job, we can say, this is what I know. And I can document it because my library is kept up. And I learned it from Syracuse University, and I learned it from Shanghai, and I learned it from China, and I learned it from Italy, and I learned it from whatever. And the librarians connected me with it, and they authenticate and make sure that that is approved education. The idea that we are just as much in a content creation business as we are in a distribution business. That it's not just giving access to other people's brilliant ideas. Our libraries are there to help people develop their own ideas and to communicate those out. Think for a moment if you were to come visit Syracuse and you were to go to the Syracuse Public Library or the Onondaga County Public Library, which is where I am. How much could you learn about Syracuse from that library? The answer is not a lot. You could learn what they bought from everywhere other than Syracuse. You could learn maybe where they are. But could you learn about the active culture that's going on in entrepreneurship? Could you learn about the active arts culture? Could you listen to music created within this area? Could you understand lectures and book talks and read materials and fan fiction and literature from the Syracuse area? For too long, libraries have seen their role as bringing in all the intelligence and knowledge from the rest of the world to one location for our public. They don't need us for that anymore. What they need us for is to take the brilliance, intelligence, and amazing capacities of our communities and share those with the rest of the world. Think of a library not as a radio tuning into the world's conversation. Think of it as a loudspeaker for sharing your community's ideas and brilliance to the world. Content creation, maker spaces. The other implication is that librarians are part of a larger shift in professional service class. Now, we've always thought of service as fundamental librarianship, and it's absolutely true. But service is not, I don't want to say different, but we've developed a rather stilted, static, and somewhat outdated idea of service. We've seen service as things like being unbiased. We've seen service as being quiet. We've seen service as not speaking up. That's not service. That's being a servant. And that's not what we are. We're part of a professional service class. We're part of the same class that includes doctors and lawyers and engineers and teachers and professors. They're people who are service because the ultimate goal, their ultimate test of impact is with those that they serve, not themselves. That's true. But they're a professional service class because they cannot be transparent in that. You don't want a doctor to walk in and say, "So what do you want me to do today?" Or go in and say, "Give me a shot." You kind of hope the doctor would let you know if that's a good idea. The same with librarians. I love, once again, our previous speaker saying we're nice people. We try not to speak up. Every so often, we got to speak up. And it's true. My definition of librarian is a radical, positive change agent. Our job is to make our communities better. Our job is to make our societies better. Our job is not to be silent and simply do what is asked, but to stand up for what is right and to help for our communities to become better. To do that, we must have an active voice. I love the word radical because in English it has 3 different meanings. The first meaning is the one that many people think of, which is sort of extreme politics, outspoken politics. The other, ironically, means fundamental. In biology and medicine, when you talk about a radical procedure, it doesn't mean that it's crazy and experimental. It means that it's fundamental. The root of a tree is a radical. When you have a radical organ transplant, that means they did the whole organ, not just part of it. Radical means fundamental. And the third meaning of in English of radical, at least in the United States, is as sort of, cool and crazy, radical. And so this idea that when you put these 3 things together, you get librarian. We are about being outspoken and progress and moving people forward. We must be seen and visible and activists for our communities. But we do that based on our fundamental principles and our fundamental nature. And frankly, we do it in a very cool way. We are radical, positive change agents. We will speak up. We will be seen. We will be known. If we do not, we will simply be seen like those old maps as analog collections that have grown out of date. We will be like the doctors who do not listen and therefore do not have new patients. We must be part of the people who communicate and move those documents from static things that sit on shelves to meaningful changes in people's lives. We have to help the doctors move from this idea of people as gateways of information to people who are participating in the ongoing health of their community. We help all of our communities move forward. That is what is fundamental to how we do it. And we do it in a brilliant, networked, connected way. We do it with technology that we bring forth. We do it through our collections, but we know that there are only tools. The most important fundamental asset of any library is its librarians, is you. And if you don't use your voice, and if you don't see and push forward, and if you're not proactive in understanding what a community can be, then we'll become as antiquated as those paper maps. Thank you very much. I don't know if we have time for questions, but if we do, I'm here.